people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. In my previous video, we talked about the upcoming unification match, so to speak, for what are the vacant IBF and WBO titles in the women's light flyweight division. Former champion Evelyn Bermudez of Argentina is going to be taking on Mexican unbeaten up-and-comer Tania Enriquez.
That's a great fucking fight, by the way.
For 2 of the 4 alphabet titles at this weight. The other 2 titles are currently in possession of Jessica Neri Plata, who was in action this past Friday opposite the ring then champion Kim Clavel.
Kim lost the fight, and we talked about that.
Immediately after that fight, Kim Clavel's promoter, Yvonne Michel, talked about doing a rematch with Jessica on the premise that nobody else in the division, no other fighter, no other champion can offer Jessica the same money that they can offer her to run it back with Kim.
And he's right.
Things are shaking, rattling, and rolling in the women's light flyweight division. Titles are changing hands. New champions are being crowned. It's a very exciting time in the women's light flyweight division.
What are the odds that Kim Clavel can beat Jessica Neri Plata in a rematch?
What are the odds that she can pull it off? Because if she can't, I hate to break the news to you guys, but all those alphabet titles, all those...
The division will stay divided.
You heard what I said. The division will stay divided if Kim can't pull it off against Jessica. Jessica Neri Plata herself doesn't have a promotional outfit behind her.
Not to my knowledge, and not a major one. So on the premise that Jessica were to fight Kim again and beat her again, what you then have to ask yourself is, how do unification matches happen when these fighters, these champions, don't have major promotional outfits behind them the same way that Kim did?
Kim at least had Canadian-based promoter Yvonne Michel, who can more than afford to bankroll fights, unification matches.
He can.
Jessica ain't got no major promotional outfit behind her, thus her team can't afford to finance a major fight with the winner of Bermudez versus Enriquez.
When it comes to that fight, to my knowledge, Tania Enriquez, she doesn't have a major promoter behind her either, one that could afford to finance a unification match with another champion at this weight.
I mean, that's why she's getting on a plane. That's why she's traveling to Argentina. If she had a major promoter behind her, the same way that Yocasta Valle did, it would be Evelyn Bermudez traveling to her, not the other way around. So to my knowledge, Tania ain't got no major promotional outfit behind her either.
Evelyn does have a promotional outfit behind her, but not a major one.
Not a golden boy, not a top rank, not a matchroom, a Queensbury, not a boxer.
Though she does have a promotional outfit behind her, a local one.
OR Promotions, an Argentinian-based local outfit that bankrolls her fights.
But as you can imagine, it doesn't cost OR Promotions an arm and a leg to have an unbeaten up-and-comer like Tania Enriquez fly out to their side of things, because Tania
Enriquez, great fighter that she might be, unbeaten up-and-comer, talented, she's not a marquee fighter, you understand. Doesn't cost an arm and a leg to get a fighter like that in the ring. If anything, this is an opportunity for Tania.
It is more of an opportunity for Tania than it is for Evelyn.
I mean, it is opportunity for both women to become world champions at their weight, but Evelyn Bermudez is a more established name at light flyweight than Tania Enriquez is. This would be a coming out party for Tania if she were to win.
In any event, neither Jessica Neri Plata or Tania Enriquez have major promotional outfits behind them.
Evelyn Bermudez does. She does have a promoter, but it's not a major promoter. It's not a major outfit. And depending on what happens in the Bermudez versus Enriquez fight,
and depending on what happens in the Clavel versus Plata rematch, this division could stay divided for a while.
It might. I just wonder, how much money would it take to make a fight between, say, Jessica Neri Plata and Evelyn Bermudez? Should Evelyn beat Tania?
Is that a fight that Jessica Neri Plata, as a unified champion, would fly out for? How much money would it cost? How much money would it take to make it happen?
It's a legitimate question.
If Kim falters for the second time at the hands of Jessica Neri Plata, who's going to bankroll the fights to see an undisputed champion crowned in this division?
Because someone would have to. The money's got to come from somewhere.
It does.
And on the off chance that Kim Clavel actually defeats Jessica Neri Plata, who's to say she goes straight into another fight with another champion?
We are getting ahead of ourselves. We don't know for sure that there's going to be a rematch between Kim and Jessica. For all I know, maybe Kim decides to move up to the next weight class. Maybe she likes her chances against those champions as opposed to the ones at light flyweight.
She might.
There is also the subject of Senicia Estrada to be addressed.
Senicia Estrada, who very briefly held the WBO title at light flyweight before moving back down to minimum weight. Currently, she's set to go into her own unification match opposite the ring German WBC champion Tina Ruprecht. At some point, Senicia is going to move back up to the light flyweight division, though it will be a very different weight class from whence she left.
She's going to have her work cut out for her.
She will have the winner of Bermudez versus Enriquez to deal with, as well as Jessica Neri Plata, if she stays a unified champion.
Stiff competition.
Just being honest, much stiffer than what she's got to deal with down there at minimum weight. Tina Ruprecht, Yo Castavalle, I would give Senicia Estrada very good odds opposite the ring, those fighters. But up there at light flyweight, opposite the ring, Jessica Neri Plata and the winner of Bermudez versus Enriquez. Those are tougher assignments. In other news, Oscar De La Hoya takes a shot at influencer fights, calls for return to real boxing.
DAZN staged another one of their Misfits shows this past weekend, KSI and all those good folks.
Myself, as a consumer, I don't actually mind them because it's an either-or kind of deal, either-or situation. You're either gonna buy it or you're not.
It's no sweat off my back.
Oscar De La Hoya apparently has limited patience for influencer boxing, even the kind promulgated by one of his most important business connections. The Golden Boy Promotions head took aim at boxing's recent spate of crossover boxing cards featuring inexperienced social media stars, YouTubers, TikTokers, gloving up against each other in sanctioned bouts. The latest permutation of this combat sports phenomenon, which is, in one sense, an offshoot of a much longer tradition of celebrity boxing, saw British influencer KSI take on FaZe Temper last Saturday at Wembley Arena in London. KSI knocked out Temper in the opening round. Soon after the card ended, De La Hoya made it clear he belonged in the critics' camp. Can we just go back to real boxing soon? De La Hoya tweeted.
That depends. Do the real boxers want to behave like real boxers?
I mean, look at Ryan Garcia. Ryan Garcia is the one who runs around telling everybody that belts don't matter in the sport. Isn't that your guy?
How are we supposed to get back to real boxing with that kind of an ideology?
The irony of it all, Oscar asking that question, when are we going to get back to real boxing, promoting a guy with that kind of work ethic, that kind of mindset?
Doesn't even want to see himself become a champion.
I've long felt that because boxing is lacking in many areas, it allowed this influencer boxing to carve out a lane of its own. If the sport were delivering in all the ways that it's supposed to deliver, perhaps influencer boxing wouldn't have even caught on.
If the fights that need to happen did happen.
This is an extension of celebrity boxing, after all, but celebrity boxing never really took off in previous eras the same way that it's taking off in this one, because this is a more political era.
There are a lot more roadblocks, a lot more obstacles in this era of boxing than in previous eras, so a lot of fights that need to happen don't happen.
Which creates a void that needs to be filled with something, in my humble opinion. I mean, at minimum, I think that these novelty acts would be a lot harder to sell if the sport...
If it were at the forefront of the sporting world the way it was in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s.
Yeah, I think these dog and pony shows would be a lot harder to sell if the sport itself were at the forefront of the sporting world, but it's not. Politics have a lot to do with that.
I don't actually think that influencer boxing is a detriment to the sport per se. I believe it's a byproduct of an existing detriment to the sport, which is politics.
These kids aren't taking food off any actual boxer's plate. They come into the sport with an already existing audience willing to consume that content. In many ways, it's the reverse. It's backwards. Where an actual boxer, an actual pugilist, hopes to amass a following over time by developing as a boxer, these kids come into the sport already having a following.
An existing audience.
Not having put in the same work in the gym that an actual boxer, an actual pugilist puts in. They already have an audience to market these shows to, but they're not necessarily dividing an audience.
They're not sharing an audience with an actual boxer.
Thus, they're not taking any food off of any boxer's plate. If anything, these shows are bringing a little bit more awareness to the sport, more than the actual boxers are bringing to the sport, because they're at minimum giving their audience what they want.
Supply and demand, basic principle of business.
Now, I myself, as a longtime consumer of the sport, I've got nothing against influencer boxing, even if I don't consume that content myself.
There's nothing wrong with it.
When addressing Oscar De La Hoya's comment that we should get back to real boxing, there's a lot of irony in there, because Ryan Garcia is intended to be a real boxer, a real pugilist, and this is a guy who places no emphasis on becoming a world champion.
No emphasis on tradition.
You want to get back to real boxing? Why don't we get started with the guy that's in your stable?
The one who claims that belts don't matter.
Those influencer kids move the needle, whether Oscar likes it or not, whether the purists like it or not. I think one of those KSI pay-per-views, the one before last, sold 500,000 buys.
I don't know what this last one sold.
Though what we can't do is hang the existing problems of the sport on these influencers and use them as some kind of scapegoat for where we are now.
Sport's got problems.
Organizations like the WBC that basically have caused the men's welterweight division in the real sport of boxing, that division, to stagnate due to special privileges allowed to a fighter like Errol Spence Jr., a champion who's being allowed to defend his welterweight title above welterweight at junior middleweight for no title at all.
Against his mandatory.
What's supposed to be his mandatory? Try explaining that? Word sandwich. The sport of boxing has problems, rest assured. And influencer boxing, it's pretty low on the totem pole.
There were a lot of contributing factors that have led to the sport of boxing's departure from the mainstream sporting world in America over the years, and influencer boxing is really not one of them.
Another comment, another insight from Oscar De La Hoya, I think, is more of a contributing factor to the rise of influencer boxing than most actual boxers realize. Oscar De La Hoya stated, PBC on Fox fighters who are under a spell must realize they have no legacy. You are just a tool and will never be a legend. Hashtag, I'm sorry.
Look at Keith Thurman.
It's not a Hall of Fame career. You're not a Hall of Famer because you beat Danny Garcia, Sean Porter, took 2 years off, and then lost to Manny Pacquiao.
Not a Hall of Fame career, doesn't create excitement in the division, doesn't create excitement for the sport.
Being as sparsely active as he has been sparsely active. You look at a fighter like Jermall Charlo, a guy who hasn't been very active. He fought only once. 2021, didn't fight at all in 2022.
He's not creating excitement in the division. He's not creating excitement for the sport.
Not saying that the PBC's soft matchmaking has created a lane for influencer boxing per se. I'm saying that those novelty acts are a bit easier to sell when the actual sport isn't delivering.
PBC fighters have a lot to do with that.
For the longest time, Gervonta Davis versus Vasyl Lomachenko was a conversation, but alas, it's a fight that didn't happen when it needed to and isn't going to happen.
The fights that capture the audience's imagination, the fights that the fans really want to see, that they show up for, those kinds of fights don't often happen these days.
The inflated sense of self, the inflated egos of fighters that don't necessarily reflect their market value in the open market, and the fights that don't happen as a result of those egos.
I'm just telling you, there's some fat kid that likely lives at home with his parents with a bigger social media following, bigger social media presence than the one that some of these pugilists have.
When that kid laces up the gloves, he moves the needle with his boxing match more than you do.
So lay off the Hollywood act.
Boxing in many ways did this to itself, Fighters that want to be businessmen more than they want to be fighters. When the audience is not paying to see you be a businessman, the audience is paying to see you fight. The moment you stop realizing that,
it does relate to Oscar De La Hoya's statement.
Even if his statement, the target of it, is a bit more specific. There is truth in that notion that, some of those guys at the PBC, for example,
They ain't got the same kind of legacies as a Sugar Ray Leonard, for example, and they don't create the excitement in the sport that a Sugar Ray Leonard did or a Roberto Duran.
those kinds of fighters. As a result of that, as a result of fighters trying to be businessmen more than boxers,
The audience dwindles because the audience ain't paying to see you be a business guy, paying to see you be a boxer.
tired old argument that boxing is a business. Yeah, every organized sport that is a sport is also a business. That doesn't change that it's a sport, and it's a sport that people are paying to see.
Not a business.
What you want is for us to get back to real boxing. The real boxers need to act like real boxers.
That includes Ryan.
Still is an interesting nugget of truth in Oscar De La Hoya's comments and his critique about PBC fighters in particular and their overall lack of a legacy. I do happen to agree.
People don't see it now. They don't see it in the moment that a lot of these guys...
Marcus Brown, David Benavidez, Caleb Plant.
I'm just telling you that based on what they've done so far, these guys don't get in the Hall of Fame.
Not based on what they've done so far. Fighters like Keith Thurman, fighters like Danny Garcia.
These guys don't get in the Hall of Fame.
They ain't got legacies. I'm just telling you, they ain't got legacies. I don't agree with everything Oscar De La Hoya says, but I do agree with that.
These guys ain't getting in the Hall of Fame.
They ain't got the legacies for it. They opted for Al Heyman's distorted view of the sport, more emphasis on business and less emphasis on boxing. And as a result of that, in years to come, you'll realize how forgettable, just how forgettable these fighters and their careers were.
Because Danny Garcia wasn't to the Puerto Rican boxing scene what Felix Trinidad was or Macho Camacho before him.
Keith Thurman, who has mostly been a career welterweight in the welterweight division, being one of the historically relevant divisions, I can tell you that Keith Thurman ain't no Sugar Ray Leonard and no Tommy Hearns.
Wasn't that kind of welterweight.
You really think he's going to get in the hall because he beat Danny Garcia and Sean Porter? Solid wins. Solid wins that they were at the time. How many solid wins does a Sugar Ray Leonard have? How many does a Roberto Duran?
Where does Keith Thurman rank in a conversation with those kind of welterweights, those kinds of fighters, those kinds of guys?
Gary Russell, who was a champion in the men's featherweight division for a very long time and created next to no excitement for the division as a result.
Nope.
Sparse schedule of activity. One fight a year for something like 5 or 6 years. Can he get in the Hall of Fame?
Will he?
Al Heyman's breed of boxer is more business-minded than boxing-minded, and as a result of that, many of these fighters have no legacy.
I don't know, maybe Wilder might get in the Hall on the premise of his 10 title defenses and the excitement of the Fury trilogy, but remember, that is a trilogy that for the most part he lost.
You have to factor that into it as well. Leo Santa Cruz and Adrian Bronier were both 4 division champions.
You know, they weren't 4 division champions the same way that Chocolatito has been a 4 division champion.
It's one thing that they have in common, but they're really not thought of as being from the same ilk.
When I see what Oscar De La Hoya has to say about many of those guys, those PBC fighters, I can't help but agree. The vast majority of them, they don't have legacies to fall back on.
Kind of careers and the kind of legacies that people are going to remember for years to come?
I don't see it.
I don't know, maybe it's because these guys rather pretend that they're suits than pugilists.